why we're in the situation we're in today, and what to do about it, a thoroughly rotten system, and the need for revolution. Now, some of you may have noticed right off the bat that the title of this talk contains an echo of the Richard Pryor routine of the wino and the junkie. This is one of his better known and better routines, and it's an early morning on the weekend, I believe on a Sunday, and the wino's standing out on the street corner, yelling at the cars whizzing by him. "Slow down, fool! This is a neighborhood. This ain't no residential district." And pretty soon the junkie comes on the scene, and the wino begins to philosophize about what's happened to the junkie. Brother used to be a genius. Could book the numbers without paper or pencil. Now he don't even know who he is. And then there's some back and forth, becoming more and more poignant between the wino and the junkie. And then finally, in the very poignant ending, the junkie turns to the wino and says, "I'm hurting, Pops. Can you help me?" And the wino says, with all the full irony of this, "Yes, I'm going to help you, boy, because I believe you got potential. Your problem is you don't know how to deal with a white man. I know how to deal with him. That's why I'm in the position I'm in today." So why are we in the position we're in today? And what, unlike the wino, can we do to really understand this deeply and therefore be able to do something about it, not for ourselves, but for the future of humanity and for the masses of oppressed people and ultimately all of humanity throughout the world? Now, there is an aside here I can't resist making, that this routine about the numbers would not resonate in the same way, wouldn't catch on with the same humor today. Why? Because although it exists in little pockets here and there to a large degree, the numbers has been done away with by the legalization of the lottery. So don't have the numbers racket in the same way, and you couldn't tell a joke or do a routine about it with the same poignancy and same force as Richard Pryor did 30 years ago. It's another example of the relationship between changes in the economic base and how they affect the superstructure. Just in passing. But let's turn to the main question here. How do we, and let's turn to the first part of this discussion. How do we get a true scientific understanding of how things got to be the way they are? Now, I could go way back, all the way back tens of thousands of years to the beginnings of humanity, or even farther back, 3.5 billion years to the earliest forms of life on this planet, or even beyond that, back 15 billion years or so to the time of the Big Bang and the beginning of our universe as we know it. And I could make an attempt, which would have to be a valiant one, to trace everything from then and all the different contradictions and things they gave rise to and all the relationship between accident and necessity and contingency and causality all the way up to where we are now. But I think that might be a little bit ambitious under the circumstances. Well, to be more limited, I could begin with the time that Europeans began colonizing the Americas, or the time when the United States of America came into existence at the end of the 18th century, and then almost immediately began expanding and seizing more territory, spreading the slave system as well as the emerging capitalist system into new territories, including huge areas that had been part of Mexico. Or I could begin at the time after the Civil War, which ended slavery, with the further westward expansion of the U.S. and the completion of the theft of the land of the native peoples with all its genocidal dimensions. Or I could go to the time of the Spanish-American War, quote unquote, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, which involved the conquest by the U.S. of new colonies that had been controlled by Spain, such as Puerto Rico and Cuba in the Caribbean, and as far away as the Philippines. And it was also in this same general period that the U.S. annexed Hawaii as well as Guam, all of which marked a new level of emergence of the U.S. on the world scene as an imperialist power, contending with other imperialist powers for colonies and domination of whole peoples that could be brutally exploited. But here I'm going to focus on the rise of U.S. imperialism to its position as the top dog imperialist power, and then to its role as the only remaining superpower, tracing this of necessity briefly and in broad strokes from the time of World War II, which put an end to the Great Depression of the 1930s, up to the 1960s, and then beyond to the end of the Cold War, and from there to the situation we face today. Again, this can only be of necessity, very brief and in broad strokes. For a moment, however, before getting directly into that, let's take a relatively brief detour, an historical detour, which can provide an important example of the role of accident, or of the relation between necessity and accident, or causality and contingency, as well as illustrating the interconnectedness of things, and how the development of human society and social and world relations is affected by all this, including this interconnectedness. Here you had the fact that at the time of Columbus, at the end of the 15th century, the route to the Far East, through what we call the Middle East today, was controlled by an Islamic empire, the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, the land route was blocked that way. So Columbus got backing, even though he wasn't Spanish, he got backing from the emerging colonial Spanish government, which was anxious to open up new areas of exploitation. He got backing to go by a sea route to the Far East, the Indies, as he was searching for. But he ended up, through a combination of necessity and accident, somewhere else in the Americas. And this opened the door to centuries of colonization, conquest, and exploitation of the people living in the Americas on an ever-expanding scale by growing powers in Europe. It was very closely related and broadened the scope of the slave trade in Africa. Here we can't help but recalling Marx's ironic and sardonic statement about the rosy dawn of capitalist accumulation, in paraphrasing how he spoke to how this arose on a foundation of hunting down and then exploiting slaves from the colony of Africa and shipping them to the Americas in the millions, with millions dying on the way, to exploit them to build up the wealth of what became the West. And he spoke about the literal entombment, as he said, the burying alive of the Indians who were forced to dig the silver out of the mines in places like Potosi in Bolivia. It's been estimated that 9 million people died, native peoples died in those silver mines during the heyday of particularly Spanish colonialism. And Marx also pointed out how all this increasingly gave rise to the need for and the exploitation of child labor in places like England itself. This was the rosy dawn and the foundation of all the wealth that's so celebrated everywhere you turn these days. And this also illustrates the fundamental need to move beyond all this, to reach a whole new era in human history and human social relations. But you can see here the interconnectedness of things, and also the dialectical relation between necessity and accident, or causality and contingency, and how nothing was preordained, but certain contradictions were resolved certain ways through various struggles, and this in turn brought new necessity forward. And then the same process is repeated, and it ended up. It was not bound to end up, but it ended up where it did, and still casts its shadow and has its influence down to today, not only in the West, but throughout the world. Now, having completed that brief detour, let's return then to the main subject at hand and begin with the following survey, again briefly and in very broad strokes, of how over the period since World War II, we've gotten to the situation that we're in today. First, the social configuration or social anatomy of U.S. society, or to put it in more classically Marxist terms, the features and relations of the different classes and social groupings within U.S. society, was not always the way it has been for most of our lifetimes, including with its big, soft middle. This reminds me of the Paul Simon song, "You Can Call Me Al." Man walks down the street, says, "Why am I soft in the middle? I'm so soft in the middle now." Well, again, this big, soft middle did not always exist to this extent in the U.S., just as the position of the U.S. in the world has not always been as it has been during this same period. So why indeed has that been the case? How did it become the case? How did all this come about? This was something that happened coming out of the Great Depression of the 1930s through and in the aftermath of World War II, and particularly as a result of the outcome of that war, in which to a very large degree the Soviets did the fighting for the Western imperialists, and in particular the U.S., which hung back and then stepped in to scoop up the spoils. And through this, the U.S. became the uncontested top dog among the imperialist powers in the world. Now, here once more, I can't resist another aside, which is actually important, which hopefully is why I can't resist it. During the Depression of the 1930s, it was the whole capitalist world whose economy was grinding to a halt, and in fact going into reverse, if you will, with the accompanying massive unemployment. For example, in the U.S., somewhere between a fourth and a third of the labor force was out of work for most of the 1930s. While the economy of the Soviet Union, and in particular massive industrialization there, was leaping ahead. Ironically, this situation and the triumphalism that did arise in the Soviet Union and among its supporters throughout the world on the basis of this may well have reinforced and strengthened already existing tendencies to economism and the more or less linear and direct equating of large-scale industrial development with the advance and ultimate triumph of socialism, tendencies I noted in Conquer the World, for example. But exploring that further will have to wait for another time. Here, let's go directly to a brief survey of what resulted in the U.S. in particular through and in the aftermath of World War II, which was, in fact, the overwhelming factor in putting an end to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Well, among these developments, as I have noted, was the growth of a large middle class in the U.S. The position of U.S. imperialism coming out of World War II provided the objective basis to stimulate the growth of this middle class on a much broader basis than had previously existed. While policies like the GI Bill and agencies like the Veterans Administration, or VA, and the Federal Housing Authority, or FHA, were some of the key means through which this was effected. And also, of course, linked to this, as I've spoken to before, was a development largely out of military/defense needs of the underwriting by the federal government of a whole development of an interstate highway system, which was, as I said, important for military means, but also made much more possible suburbanization. And when government subsidies through a GI Bill and in other ways provided the means for this housing to be built and to be sold, this obviously had a large and lasting impact on social relations in the U.S. and on the whole configuration, again, if you will, of the U.S. So this is one important development which I can only briefly refer to here and sketch in the very briefest of terms. Along with this went the bourgeoisification of large sections of the working class. Just as there wasn't always this big soft middle, quote unquote, there weren't always such large or significant, broad however you want to put it, bourgeoisified sections within the U.S. working class. On the level that we're more familiar with this, this really is a phenomenon coming out of World War II and in its aftermath, and as a result of the position of U.S. imperialism through which it achieved, again largely on the basis of others fighting, through that war. All during that war, the U.S. was jockeying, for example, in the Far East. Not only was it fighting with Japan, which is where the most serious fighting went on by the U.S. in World War II, but also it was jockeying in relation to France and Britain in particular to be able to scoop up the colonies that they had previously held in these areas. And in the aftermath of World War II and within a decade afterward, that also extended into the Middle East as well, where the U.S. became, achieved supremacy over other former or other European imperialist powers who'd formerly held the top colonial positions. Or in the case of the Middle East, France and England coming out of World War I had divided the Middle East more or less among themselves. But the U.S. moved into all these areas and was able to scoop up all these colonies. Once again, this provided the material basis not only for the large-scale extension of the middle class, but interpenetrating with that and overlapping with it was the bourgeoisification of much broader sections of the working class in the U.S., particularly the more unionized workers, especially those concentrated in larger-scale industries and enterprises. Once again, as I've touched on, this was a result of both the objective position of the U.S. imperialists and conscious policy on their part. And in this case, particularly of the bourgeoisification of broad sections of the working class, it involved the entering into a certain social contract with the heads of a large union, such as the steel union, the auto union, and so on, in which a more or less conscious agreement was made whereby a certain package would be given to these workers, not only higher wages, but health benefits, pensions, the expectation of being able to hang on to the job and retire in a relatively good position, while other sections of the working class were excluded from this. But this was a significant phenomenon coming out of World War II. Also extremely significant is the fact that at the same time, all this reinforced and heightened white supremacy and the corresponding gap between the situation of black people and that of whites in particular. As is spoken to in the book I referred to by Rodecker, Working Toward Whiteness, and also a book by Katznelson called When Affirmative Action Was White, New Deal policy, especially coming out of World War II, consciously was wielded to increase this gap and to reinforce and heighten white supremacy. This was both conscious policy on the part of the ruling class as a whole and also had to do with the particular configuration of ruling class politics in the U.S. historically and down to the present, including in that time, whereby the South had certain disproportional representation in the government, the white South. Owing to the whole Ku Klux Klan terror, the whole system of Jim Crow, the whole legalization of an oppressed status for the masses of black people and for the black nation as a whole coming out of the Civil War, and particularly after the reversal of Reconstruction and betrayal of Reconstruction. Black people, as we all know, were excluded up until the 1960s from voting after Reconstruction, effectively excluded. And this meant that there was a continuation of the situation that had existed from the beginning of the country, and I'll have more to say about this in another talk on Jeffersonian democracy, communism and Jeffersonian democracy. But it was a continuation of the situation that had existed throughout the country, whereby the South actually had the white Southern plantation owners and other ruling class strata had a disproportionate political influence within the ruling class and the country as a whole. This worked out partly through the whole 3/5 proviso in the U.S. Constitution, which apportioned voting and taxation on the basis of counting slaves. This was the historic compromise, counting slaves as 3/5. In fact, Gary Wills, which I'll talk about in the next talk on communism and Jeffersonian democracy, has a new book out called The Negro President. And it's not about a Negro who was president. It's about Thomas Jefferson, which is, the focus of a lot of Gary Wills' work. And basically, this refers to the fact that Jefferson would not have been elected had it not been for the extra votes that accrued to the South because of the 3/5 provision. And this is a reason why, if you look at the history of the U.S., without going too far afield here, so many of the early presidents were from the South, and in particular from Virginia, Washington, Madison, Monroe, if I'm not mistaken, definitely Jefferson. And this was basically, after coming back more to the present, after the Civil War and the reversal and betrayal of Reconstruction, the whole Jim Crow system basically continued this, so that white Southerners, the way the U.S. government works without getting all caught up in all that bureaucratic stuff, but there's something important to understand about it. The Congress in particular works by committees, and the seniority in the committees gives you a lot of power. Well, these white Southerners would keep getting elected because of the situation in the South and the situation with black people. So they exerted a disproportionate influence on the government as a whole. They would get seniority, they would head key committees, they'd wield a lot of power. Those are the peculiarities, if you will, of U.S. bourgeois politics and its internecine character and battles within the ruling class. And so what happened with the New Deal coming out of World War II was that both on the part of the general consensus in the ruling class and also because of the particular insistence of Southern politicians, the New Deal was consciously crafted, and the policies flowing out of World War II were consciously crafted to reinforce white supremacy. Southern politicians with a lot of influence would threaten to veto any New Deal legislation that in any way threatened the pattern of social and economic relations that existed in the South. So through all this is what occurred with the New Deal. It broadened, it widened the gap, in particular between black people and white people in the U.S., and it also, in an overall sense, reinforced white supremacy. Now, the growth of a fairly large middle class and the phenomenon of class consciousness being blunted among the working class in the U.S. had certain particular roots in the historical development of this country, including the quote-unquote opening to the West, or opening of the West, through war and genocide and the theft of land from both the native peoples and Mexico. The way this worked was that if you were in an emerging working class in a different city, say in the East, after the Civil War in particular, and after the Mexican-American War, when more and more land was grabbed up in the West, first of all, before the Civil War, this led to the expansion of the slave system, but afterward it provided the basis for people to move to the West to settle sort of another bargain the government fashioned with large numbers of white people, which was that you moved to the West, which at that time might have meant Missouri or something, but you kept settling the land in the West that had been cleared of the native peoples and stolen from Mexico, and you would be able to get land basically free and farm it. So this was a huge sort of safety valve and outlet for any kind of developing working class and working class consciousness in the history of the U.S. Didn't blunt it entirely, but it did blunt it in significant ways. And this class consciousness was also blunted in very significant ways in the history of the U.S. as a result of what's been called the peculiar institution, what a euphemism, the peculiar institution of slavery for hundreds of years in what became the United States, and for nearly 100 years after the country became independent from Great Britain. Slavery, we should understand very clearly, was an integral part of the development of the U.S. economy overall. The way in which the U.S. economy has historically developed could never have taken place without slavery. Now, if they hadn't had slavery, something else would have happened. But the particular way in which it developed was all bound up with slavery. It was an integral part of this, in other words. And of the economy overall, Obviously, this was directly so in the South, but also in a major way in relation to emerging capitalism centered in the North. I don't have time to go into all of this now, but the products that were grown in the South, many of which were sold to England rather than New England, nevertheless indirectly contributed to the development of manufacture in the North. And then obviously those products that were grown in the South through slave labor and exchanged to the North, or with the North, also contributed to the development of manufacture in the North. It is impossible to conceive of this economy developing the way it has and with the wealth it has without the whole history of slavery. The U.S., in other words, would never have developed its economic base in the powerful way it did, nor would the ruling class have become as powerful as it is without slavery. That's just a basic truth that everyone should understand. And it also would never have happened, as I've referred to, without the continuing conquest and theft of land. But the economic strength, the territorial reach, and the political and ultimately military power of the U.S. ruling class, and with all this, its ability to bribe broad sections of the working class and stimulate the growth of the middle class, was raised to a qualitatively higher level as a result of World War II and the related things that I've touched on here. And all this is, among other things, a very sharp and profound example of the point that Lenin emphasized, that with the development of imperialism, there opens up and deepens a split in the working class between the more upper bribed sections, bourgeoisified sections, and what he emphasized as the lower and deeper, more exploited sections of the proletariat. And while it would be wrong to have a sectarian approach toward those strata that are not part of the lower, deeper sections of the proletariat, it is very important to understand the strategic significance of this strata, or these strata of the lower and deeper sections of the proletariat, which do exist in the U.S., and are the most bedrock basis for the proletarian revolution. At the same time, the same general period to which I'm speaking, the emergence of two major developments in the world that were posing a powerful counterweight to this position of U.S. imperialism as top dog in the imperialist world. One was the further development and qualitatively greater strength of the socialist camp. Though this was full of contradiction, even very acute contradiction, due to very strong and growing revisionist tendencies in the leadership of the Soviet Union in particular, coming out of World War II. And this socialist camp and its strength in the world lasted, as it turned out, only for a very short period of time, more or less only a decade, from the end of World War II to the mid-1950s. The other phenomenon to which I'm referring, which was posed a powerful counterweight to this position of U.S. imperialism, was the rise of a powerful wave of anti-colonial movements and struggles throughout what we now call the Third World, which arose very powerfully, once again, coming through and in the aftermath of World War II. At the same time, there were major changes in the U.S., and there was the eruption of major struggles in the U.S., most especially the development of the struggle of black people, which took place in turn in this larger international context and was driven forward by both important economic and political factors, which again I can only touch on here briefly, and I've spoken to this somewhat in other writings and talks, but here I'll just try to briefly summarize. Among these factors on the international level, there was the factor of economic competition, that other imperialists who control other parts of the world were developing means of cheapening the production of cotton, for example, exploiting people in places like Egypt or Pakistan. And even in places within the U.S., like Arizona, for example, there was a development of more irrigated means of growing cotton, which is obviously one of the main products of the old Black Belt South. It's kind of emblematic of what was happening. At the same time, as a result of World War II and the technology that had been developed through it, there was a stimulation of the production of things, of mechanical means of carrying out many functions in agriculture that had previously been carried out by intensively exploiting human labor. For example, mechanical picking machines to pick cotton, and other means of planting as well as harvesting crops. Those economic factors were working to expel large numbers of black people from the Black Belt soil in which their oppression had been rooted, first in the days of slavery and then in sharecropping and other forms of basically semi-feudal exploitation after the reversal of Reconstruction and up through World War II and for a little time afterward. The same system which had forced the masses of black people to remain on the southern plantations in one form or another, both before and after slavery, and had brutally and viciously exploited them there, now expelled them in large numbers because it was more profitable to do so, and the need for human labor was reduced in these agricultural fields under these new circumstances, which I briefly touched on. At the same time, masses of black people were drawn to the cities of the South, but especially to the North. Using the terms of sociological terms, there was both the push of these economic factors expelling them off the land and the pull of the lure of a possibly better life in the North in particular, where segregation still existed, where brutality still existed, but it wasn't in the same overt forms. And there seemed to be the possibility of more economic gain working in the North. So those were some of the economic factors and social factors. At the same time, politically, these economic changes gave impetus to or stimulated a certain sense that there needed to be certain social and political changes. And this went along with the fact that the U.S. was in intense rivalry with the Soviet Union and the short-lived socialist camp coming out of World War II, and then was in rivalry with the Soviet Union as an imperialist power in its own right, a social imperialist power, socialist in name, but imperialist in reality after the mid-50s. In other words, what's commonly referred to as the Cold War was very intense. In this kind of context, when you're trying to pose as the great champions of freedom and democracy in the world, I mean, we still hear it today. The leader of the free world. How many times do you still hear that phrase? Or the references to the free world. Well, they were all over the place in those days. That's when we got the Pledge of Allegiance added under God. It's very interesting. I can't resist this one either. Michael Nidau went to the Supreme Court, and he really shot down Rehnquist, because Rehnquist argued, there was just a ruling out against Nidau I saw in some local court. This is, that the "In God We Trust" and the money is just to become a common binding secular statement. This is really Orwellian and Alice in Wonderland, "In God We Trust" is a binding secular statement. If that's secular, I'd like to hear something religious. But in any case, they "In God We Trust" got put into under God got put into the Pledge of Allegiance at that time because of the rivalry with the Soviet Union explicitly to differentiate us from those atheistic communists. And that's why when Nidau was in the Supreme Court, Michael Nidau, he was in the Supreme Court, and Rehnquist said, isn't this, this under God, isn't that just sort of a broad, almost secular statement of common purpose? And Nidau replied, I find it very difficult to believe that under God means no God. But nevertheless, this is when this got added into the Pledge of Allegiance. One nation under God. I can remember the days, that's how old I am, when it wasn't in there. So it was explicitly put in to contrast the free world from the enslaving atheistic communist world, quote unquote, of the Soviet Union in particular. Well, how does it look in this kind of a situation where when the whole world can see, when we didn't have the internet then, but you did have developing means of communication? How does it look when the whole world can see that there's this whole group of people in your country that you're lynching and refusing to allow even the rights that you proclaim as the basis for your being the free world, the right to vote, the right to go and sit down in a restaurant and eat? You know, that people could be lynched for that kind of thing? It didn't look very good. So this also gave impetus to why sections of the U.S. ruling class went to battle even with other sections to say we have to make certain changes here. We have to get rid of some of this overt reducing of a whole group of people to second-class citizens or to an oppressed group. The whole world can see it, and it doesn't look very good when we're out posing as the champions of the free world. So these economic and political factors of various kinds reacted with and reinforced each other. And however, the changes that were brought about would not have been brought about had there not been this whole impetus given to this by this massive struggle that took place in this context, beginning centered in the South at the beginning among black people and spreading to the whole country and winning support from broad sections of the people in the U.S. So when you bring all those factors together, you get major changes and a lot of upheaval going on in the U.S. And a lot of what we see today among reactionary social forces is in turn a reaction against those kinds of changes and ideological and cultural changes that were bound up with them or arose in relationship and were mutually reinforced by them. And I'll talk about that more as we go along. Now, the Vietnam War was, in a real sense, a combination of the first two powerful factors and trends that I've mentioned here. The temporary growth and strengthening of the socialist camp coming out of World War II, and particularly with the victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. Even as major contradictions were sharpening within that camp. And at the same time, closely penetrating with this and bound up with it, this powerful wave of rising national liberation struggles in the Third World. China being a clear example of how these two trends were bound together in the Chinese Revolution. And the Vietnam War ended up bringing about and contributing in a major way to big changes in the world, including not only major political but also economic difficulties for U.S. imperialism. It was in this context, and largely as a result of these factors, that many of the key arrangements among the imperialists that had been hammered out at the end of World War II came apart or were broken apart. One key example of this is the Bretton Woods Agreement. That's named for a town in New Hampshire, if I remember correctly, where these imperialist representatives met to basically hammer out the financial system and financial relations of the imperialists coming out of World War II. For example, the dollar was set at a certain fixed price in relation to gold, and that the dollar became kind of the gold standard and the currency of last resort for the whole world imperialist system. It was kind of the backup for everything, and you could sort of count on it at a fixed rate in relation to gold. As a result of it, in relation to what happened through Vietnam in particular, Nixon ended up breaking apart that agreement, unhinging the dollar from its fixed price in relation to gold. And along with that, he did things like rationing gas, instituting price controls, and so on. These were big changes not only within the U.S., but in the whole structure of relations of imperialism and world relations ultimately. But through the same period, there was the sharpening of contradictions within the socialist countries and within what had been, for a very short period, the socialist camp, resulting in things turning into their opposites in very profound ways, with very far-reaching effects and consequences. There was the change, first of all, in the Soviet Union in the mid-1950s. Change from socialist to capitalist imperialist, when revisionists finally and completely seized power in the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the leading institution in the Soviet Union, and took it back down the road to capitalism. Now, as I've referred to, these revisionist tendencies had been for some time strong and growing in strength within the leadership of the Soviet Party. But there was a qualitative leap with the rise to power of the group around Khrushchev in the first instance in the mid-50s. And then a couple of decades later, as we know all too well, the same fundamental change came about in China in the mid-1970s, specifically after Mao's death in 1976, when a group or clique of revisionists in that party seized control there, headed ultimately by Deng Xiaoping, and took China, as is now clear for the whole world except for a few stubborn people and idiots, I guess, to see, China is more or less openly capitalist. That doesn't mean that everyone in the world or even everyone in China understands this very well, or even understand, and certainly they don't understand it scientifically. But the outer manifestations of this are clear for all to see, all but those, who literally won't see it. It's all too clear. Now, the reversal of socialism in China, among other things, coming after the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union, had all kinds, as we would expect, has had all kinds of major repercussions in the world. And one of these, which I'll touch on a bit later, is that it merged with and strengthened tendencies such as Islamic fundamentalism, particularly, as we would expect, in historically Islamic countries. Now, I cited in another talk this comment by this guy who I think was one of the Mideast correspondent for Newsweek, one of these bourgeois magazines, who was commenting after the bombing of the subway, I guess they call them what do they call them in England? The tubes anyway, and the trains in London. He said, well, a lot of these people a generation or so ago would have been communists or Maoists, but now they're Islamic fundamentalists. Now, not that communists or Maoists, just to be clear, for those who want to make something out of something, would go around doing the kind of things these people are doing. That's not what he was referring to, and it's not what I'm pointing to as important. It's that there's been a shift ideologically in which a lot of people who are alienated, disaffected, and feeling that the world is squeezing them out of any kind of meaningful existence don't see that alternative of socialism in the same way that they did, say, three decades ago. And many of them spontaneously are turning to things like Islamic fundamentalism. This, among other things, is a direct consequence and repercussion of the defeat and reversal of socialism in China, coming a couple of decades after the reversal in the Soviet Union. We keep, in a certain way, paying for these setbacks and losses that we suffer. But that's not the end of the story. And let's move on and talk a little bit about what happened in the 1970s and into the 1980s. In the U.S., we got rising to the position of chief executive Ronald Reagan. Now, I don't have time to go into all the horrors of Ronald Reagan, but let me just focus on a few things here. For one, there was a massive deregulation of the U.S. economy, which began under Reagan in a big way. And this, for example, was signaled by and given an impetus by that strike of the air controllers that Reagan consciously set out to break and to replace the unionized workers with non-union workers at the beginning of his administration in the 1980s. This was part of a whole package of breaking down unionized labor. I mean, Reagan wasn't bothered by the fact that these unionized workers were bourgeoisified. That was not his objection. But he saw these unions as standing in the way and the continuation of certain New Deal policies that the unions embodied in certain ways, standing in the way of the needs and interests of the ruling class, as he and the section identified with him saw those interests. So there was that kind of breaking down of unions and the beginning of wide-scale deregulation of the economy, environmental regulation, regulation of the media by the government to make certain concessions to smaller aggregations of capital or independent media or whatever. All these kind of things happen within the U.S. itself, as well as an insistence on a whole leap in deregulation and privatization in other countries, particularly in the third world. All this took a leap beginning with the Reagan administration. And with the IMF, International Monetary Fund, working on behalf of U.S. imperialism in particular, as well as the U.S. government directly, would go into these different countries that were indebted and so on, and would insist on the opening up of these economies much more to privatization, in particular private capital, coming from the West and more specifically from the U.S. And environmental regulations and other things which these people have declared to be restraints on trade were to be eliminated as part of restructuring the debt of these countries, for example. Now this, as I said, began in a major way with Reagan, but took off to another level once we reached the end of the Cold War and the heightened globalization that accompanied was given further impetus by this resolution of the U.S.-Soviet contradiction, using that as a shorthand. So what we saw beginning in a major way with Reagan and then taking another leap at the end of the Cold War, in other words, in the early 90s, was the further unfettering of the operation of large-scale and concentrated capital. That was in the economic sphere, not only within the U.S., but internationally. In the political or quote-unquote geostrategic sphere, the sphere of world politics and world contention and world domination on the part of the imperialists, there was a strategic orientation on the part of the Reagan administration of what they called the rollback of gains made by the Soviet Union, which was now an imperialist power itself aggressively contending with the U.S. throughout the world. Previous to the administrations to this, had more maintained a policy, for example, not only Carter, but even Ford, and even in significant ways Nixon, had maintained more a policy of containment, keep the Soviets from making any more gains in the world. But now came an aggressive policy, beginning with Reagan, of active rollback of the gains that were being made or had been made by the Soviet bloc, to put it simply. And also the rollback of struggles in the third world that the Soviet Union was aligned with, involved in, and seeking to turn to its own ends and own advantage. At the same time, there was a sharpening, and this inevitably led to a further sharpening of the contradiction between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, each now as imperialist powers heading up a powerful bloc. And this contradiction and its intensification during the period beginning in, say, the mid-70s, roughly defining it, into and through the 80s, was the main thing determining the shape and momentum of world events. In other words, it was, as we identified it, the main or principal contradiction in the world as a whole. What is a principal contradiction out of a set of contradictions? It's the one that more than any other is decisive and defining and determining of events, of the unfolding of the process. It doesn't mean there aren't other contradictions that are important, but it means that out of all those contradictions, the one that's most determining the direction of things, most defining of the character of things, is the principal contradiction. And that was, beginning in the mid-70s more or less and going through the 80s, roughly speaking, the main or principal contradiction shaping things in the world as a whole. And the danger of World War was intensifying in that period. In saying and in emphasizing that, we were very correct, and that's important also to sum up correctly. Now, at the end of the 1970s, there are two major events out of many important world events that I want to focus on because of their very profound implications. First is the Iranian Revolution. This, unfortunately, led to the rise to power of Islamic fundamentalist theocrats, people determined to impose religious rule, in this case Islamic religious rule, over all of society in Iran. Now, it's important to note and see once again the unfolding interconnectedness of things, and it's not only when we lose that there are repercussions. The other side has necessity too, and they have repercussions from what they do. It's important, for example, as an illustrationist, to see how the CIA-directed coup in Iran in 1953 that overthrew the government of Mossadegh, which had widespread, it was a secular government with widespread popular support, more or less a bourgeois democratic government in Iran, was overthrown through a CIA-directed coup, and the more or less absolute rule of the Shah of Iran was instituted as a result of that coup and the driving out of the Mossadegh government, resulting in several decades of horrendous suffering and torture, literally, not just figuratively, but literally torture on a broad scale for the masses of Iranian people. The U.S. was behind this coup, partly to control the oil in Iran and partly for larger strategic considerations of world contention among imperialists, contention with the Soviet Union, positioning itself in relationship to other governments that would try to nationalize things, as well as non-governmental national liberation movements and so on. But while it is not, and we should avoid linear straight line thinking, the world is full of contradictions and things don't follow a straight line because all these different contradictions have two sides to them, two aspects that are in contention, and they're all interweaving with a lot of other contradictions. So it's not that, U.S. imperialism, you overthrew Mossadegh, and what did you get? Khomeini. But there is some truth to that, in the sense that in the mix of all these contradictions, the overthrow of the Shah and the suffering it brought to the Iranian people in the context of larger changes going on not only in Iran but in that part of the world, in the world more broadly, did strengthen the basis on which the Islamic fundamentalist government, headed and inspired by Khomeini, came to power a few decades later. Now, as I have stressed, this was not the only possible outcome of all this. It was not the only possible outcome that could have arisen as a result of the overthrow of the Mossadegh government and the installing of the Shah, and it was not the only outcome that could have arisen out of the 1978-79 revolution in Iran in particular, but it is what ended up resulting, and that coup was a major factor in shaping some of the things that made conditions more favorable for the Islamic theocrats and Islamic fundamentalism as things developed in the world. So in a certain way, you could say that while they benefited from this coup, obviously, economically and politically and militarily and geostrategically, it also came back to haunt them in certain ways. Even while the Khomeini government and then the Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran in general does not represent any kind of fundamental challenge to imperialism, it does pose some very real problems for them, as we're seeing being played out now in a very acute way. The second event was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the war that took place there for nearly the whole decade of the 1980s, in which the U.S. played a major role, largely indirectly, in a form of proxy war. In other words, it armed and helped to organize and fund these mujahideen fighters, these Islamic fundamentalist forces, who tied down the Soviet Union with U.S. aid. And increasingly, that became a war that was draining the Soviet Union. That had a lot to do with the rise of Gorbachev and of Gorbachevism, which in turn, under circumstances, wasn't bound to, but did end up resulting in the unraveling of the whole Soviet Union and its empire in the form in which it had existed. So this was obviously a big strategic gain for the U.S. I mean, it got down to very specific things. The U.S. sold lots of, shoulder-launched Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen forces in Afghanistan. That made a big difference in their ability to shoot down helicopters. They ended up supplying several $1 billion of aid in direct and indirect forms. Brzezinski specifically said we're going to spring the Afghan trap on the Soviets and do to them what happened to us in Vietnam. Well, this was a strategic gain for them in many ways, but one of the results of it is what we see going on in the world now. these Islamic fundamentalist forces, with their own idealist view of the world, conceive of things as if they defeated one of the two big giants in the world, the Soviet Union, one of the two big empires, and now they're going to take on and defeat the other one, the remaining one, the sole superpower, the U.S. This is an entirely subjective view on their part. Doesn't even correctly reflect the battle against the Soviet Union in which they were involved and all the different forces that were at play there. But nonetheless, with this subjectivity and their worldview in general, there is a real way in which, not in a fundamental sense, in terms of opposing imperialism at its roots, but in their own way, from their own class position and outlook, they are posing real problems for U.S. imperialism. So this is another way in which things, in certain aspects, and not unimportant ones, are turning into their opposites or have turned into their opposites for U.S. imperialism. And it's another way of understanding that while these people are very powerful, they are not all powerful, and they don't control all events in the world by simply clicking a key on their computer. Or for that matter, by any other means. Things are much more wild in the world, to put it that way. Not only for us, which they are, but in general, including for our fundamental enemies. Now here, just let me step back a second and briefly survey a few things. During the 1970s and into the 1980s, there was a considerable focus on the part of U.S. imperialism, first in Africa, especially in relation to the revolutionary struggles, not communist, bourgeois-led, but revolutionary struggles in Angola and Mozambique, as well as in Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe, and in particular, a lot of attention by U.S. imperialism to the role of South Africa, partly acting again as a proxy for U.S. imperialism in relationship to the situation in those countries. And of course, in its own right, South Africa was a country that it was very important for the U.S. to buttress and to reinforce in the face of growing popular opposition of various kinds to the whole apartheid regime in South Africa. And at the end of the 70s, this focus of the U.S. to a large degree shifted for a time to Central America, especially after it had drowned a lot of these movements in Africa or newly emerged governments in Africa in a situation of horrendous slaughter and bloodshed through the use of butchers like the group Renamo in Mozambique. It was a shift to a focus on Central America, especially, again, after the Nicaraguan Revolution at the end of the 1970s. And a lot of effort was made by U.S. imperialism, as we should all remember, to A, overturn the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, and B, to prevent the same thing that had happened there from happening in countries like El Salvador and prevent the spread of this further. They armed and organized these contras. They openly called them contras. I mean, that meant contra-revolucionario, counter-revolutionary forces. You know, and they brought down horrific suffering on the people. I mean, these were, by the standards of today, unmistakably terrorist forces. They assassinated political leaders. They blew up, farming cooperatives. They blew up health clinics. But they were on the side of the free world. So we don't call them terrorists. We call them freedom fighters. And finally, the Nicaraguan government relented and allowed an election to take place, or a second election actually, and they finally were voted out of office, surprise, surprise, in the context of this not only economic and political, but outright military blackmail and aggression. But as things turned out, as important as they were, these events in Africa and Central America and the role of U.S. imperialism in relation to them did not end up casting as much of a shadow on world events, did not have as significant and lasting an impact as the Iranian Revolution with its outcome of the rise to power of Islamic fundamentalist theocrats and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the resulting war with the effects that came out of that, which I've spoken to briefly. Now, moving on, the way in which the Cold War, as it's called, was finally resolved, with the triumph of U.S. imperialism and the ending of the Soviet Union and what had been its empire, without a direct military confrontation between these two superpowers and these two imperialist blocs. This came about in a way that, for most of us and for most people in the world, both on the imperialist side and on the revolutionary side, this came about in a highly unexpected way. In Notes on Political Economy, we spoke self-critically to how we didn't anticipate the possibility of this and also certain related methodological problems in our analysis, which I won't go into here, but you can read it there. But this did get resolved in a highly unexpected way without a direct military confrontation. It was an unusual event in the history of the world that a major empire basically folded up without being handed a military defeat of strategic proportions. Yes, it had real problems in Afghanistan, but it was not handed a military defeat of strategic proportions, and for a combination of reasons which we need to study more fully. Gorbachev emerged in the leadership, and Gorbachev took the Soviet Union on a roll. That's why we've used the term Gorbachev, because he attempted to institute reforms not anticipating where this would all lead, and where it all led was to the unraveling of the Soviet Union itself. Through stages, they tried to maintain essentially the same empire in slightly different form after the Soviet Union was formally abolished, and then that came apart. And now, of course, there are forces within Russia that are trying to rebuild or reestablish a powerful imperialist empire, or sphere of influence at least, with Russia at the core of it. But the Soviet Union as existed came unraveled, it came undone, and went out of existence, and so did its empire in the form it existed, in a highly unexpected way, and in a highly unusual way, without a major military confrontation and a strategic military defeat being delivered to the Soviet Union. And this, in turn, was, as I said, something that Gorbachev did not anticipate, and whatever he might say now, clearly did not desire. But events overtook him. The dynamic that he set in motion was not one that he ended up being able to control, because the contradictions overpowered what he was seeking to do, if you want to put it that way. And I raise this not only because it's important to understand that in relation to this particular, that is the unraveling of the Soviet Union, but also to understand the way things work in the world more generally. It is, again, a wild place, and no one, no matter how powerful, has absolute control over every process, even that they set in motion. And look at the U.S. and Iraq, if you want another example. Let alone all the contradictions that are existing, being struggled out, and interpenetrating with each other, interlocking or interweaving with each other in various ways. No one has control of all that, no matter how powerful they are. And no class, no group of people in a ruling position. This is very important to understand. And we can see how this resolution of the Cold War, for example, the U.S.-Soviet contradiction and contention for short, gave rise to things which are very much bound up with major events and developments that I've mentioned that have taken place over the past several decades, and also major events and developments that are going on and intensifying right today. And this is, again, particularly true of what resulted from and was influenced by the Iranian Revolution and its outcome, and the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran on the one hand, and the Soviet-Afghan War, and the U.S. role in that war on the other hand. Out of all this, the U.S. has emerged as the sole superpower in the world. At this time, uncontested for that position by other imperialists. Doesn't mean they don't have rivalry and contradiction and economic and other kinds of competition, but no other imperialist power is challenging U.S. imperialism in its role as the sole dominant superpower imperialist in the world at this time. But still, U.S. imperialism faces major challenges, including the fact, as we see once again illustrated in Iraq, and even for that matter in Afghanistan, that as it is discovering, U.S. imperialism, as powerful as it is, cannot in a simple way resurrect the era of open colonialism that existed in the 19th and the first part of the 20th centuries. It's not so easy to do that in the world these days. Now, as a result of all these factors that I've been speaking to, and particularly as concentrated in the way the Cold War ended, quote unquote, globalization, as we have seen and as we know, has been heightened. These tendencies already existed prior to the resolution of the Cold War, but they've been heightened even qualitatively as a result of how all that was resolved. And this in turn has brought with it further far-reaching change throughout the world. Very important factors to which I've spoken in other talks and writings, for example, such as the much greater uprooting of masses of people from the countryside and even from their countries of origin. This is a massive economic and social phenomenon in the world. I mean, it's now, as I pointed out before, the situation for the first time in the history of the world that half the world's population lives in urban areas, largely not integrated into the structure of those urban of the urban scene and of those larger societies, but largely massed together in these ever-growing shanty towns around the cities in the third world. But this is a new phenomenon, not just in terms of recent history, but in the history of the world. And it's having all kinds of dislocative effects on people and giving rise to all kinds of sharply contradictory social and cultural and political and ideological trends, which I'll talk about more as we go along now and in some other talks. And within the U.S. itself, we find the ending under the drive of the beginning with Reagan, but taking a leap again with particularly the current regime. We find basically the ending of the New Deal consensus that emerged through the Great Depression of the 1930s, and in particular through and in the aftermath of World War II. And the ending of the Great Society programs that were brought forward under the beginning in the Johnson administration in particular, in response to the massive upheavals of the 1960s. Now, again, as pointed out in Notes on Political Economy, the New Deal, it's important to understand the particularities of this. The New Deal, some of whose policies I've touched on, was more aimed at the bourgeoisification of sections of the working class and the stimulation of the growth of broader sections of a middle class, while the Great Society programs more played the role of concessions to the impoverished sections of the proletariat and other basic masses. Things like Head Start programs and other programs which were aimed at overcoming the very intense oppression, and not at overcoming, but at making concessions to those who were intensely oppressed and exploited, particularly in the inner cities. So these programs for a while went hand in hand, but they were aimed at different strata of the population and had somewhat different objectives, even while they were part of an overall program. Overall unified program, particularly identified with democratic administrations, although it's interesting to note that many of these programs were carried forward and even given further impetus under the Nixon administration. And it's a rather revealing commentary on the Democratic Party. If you go back and study Nixon's policies and statements and compare them to Clinton's, Nixon sounds like he's, quote unquote, to the left of Clinton on many things. And, it's the same for all the current crop of Democratic Party politicians. So this whole social contract, which included both the New Deal and the Great Society programs, is being torn up, both out of necessity and out of freedom on the part of the sections of the ruling class that are now dominant within the U.S. as grouped presently around the Bush administration, the Bush regime. And they are doing this very deliberately and consciously. Even such things as running up massive debt, while it's driven by certain necessity, for example, to finance what's proving to be a lot more difficult war in Iraq than they anticipated, and to finance a whole broader range of military and geostrategic objectives they have in the Middle East and beyond in the world, also has a conscious element in it, where there's a conscious policy, in other words, on the part of this section of the ruling class to run up so much debt that all these kind of concessionary programs, not only things like affirmative action, but any kind of concessionary program or programs to speak to social needs, such as health care or pensions or things like that, through governmental agencies are being completely undermined, materially and economically, so that even future administrations, should they want to make or restore certain concessions of those kinds, would find it almost impossible to do so, because the economic basis is being not only objectively but also with a subjective element and a conscious element, it's being undermined. With this amount of debt and it growing all the time, and when they also are putting more permanently in place these tax cuts, it is not possible to conceive of how a ruling class party, even if it should it desire to do so, could finance the continuation of many of these programs. And this is also bound up with an ideological element, which comes in particular from the Christian fascist section of the ruling class. This guy, I think he's from the University of Texas, so Marvin Oshansky, or Olansky, whatever his name is. We can get his name specifically later on. But anyway, he's the one who coined the term compassionate conservatism. And he wrote a book by that name, I believe, and Bush wrote the preface to the book, or somebody in Bush's name wrote the preface to the book. And, you know, this is where a lot of the ideological notions are articulated, that it is not only economically unwise and politically wrong, but morally bankrupt to make people dependent for social services and needs upon the government. And that it works against people undergoing moral salvation to be able to lean on the government in that kind of way. In other words, it's cast in explicitly theological terms, but also more broadly in ideological terms, that this is morally wrong and a moral outrage, a moral crime for the government to do this, rather than this being done by people taking personal responsibility and, to the degree their circumstances overwhelm them, these needs being supplied by non-government institutions, which will also give them moral training and, in effect, moral indoctrination, i.e. faith-based programs. So this is all of a package. There's a definite element of necessity, there's a definite economic element, but there are also social and political and ideological dimensions to this. Now, through all this, there are some important changes in this period, further changes in this period in the social configuration, if you will, to use that term, within the U.S., which include the moving of large numbers of jobs away from the cities and often out of the U.S. itself, and along with this, a leap in effectively writing off large sections of the masses in the inner cities, particularly the youth, writing them off in terms of employment in the regular economy. This is once again both a combination of larger economic factors at work and even necessity for the ruling class, to find cheaper sources of labor and of production, and also conscious policy. And what has not surprisingly gone along with this is the growth of the underground economy and phenomena such as gangs within the inner city, and at the same time, of course, further leaps in the imprisonment of especially the inner city youth. Another phenomenon that has come about through all this in terms of the social configuration of within U.S. society is the weight tending to push down now significant sections of the working class, even among those formerly more bourgeoisified. There is the phenomenon that recovery and economic expansion, beginning under Clinton in a general sense, is not leading, as it did in significant ways in the past, to a rise in the wages and overall standard of living of the working class broadly. Rises in profitability are generally accompanied by job losses and the recycling down of jobs and wages, people being forced out of one layer of employment and forced to take jobs at a lower level with lower wages, less permanent work, no or very few benefits, and so on. And along with that, the outsourcing of jobs, the shipping of jobs, if you will, to other countries, although I don't particularly like that term because it implies that the jobs somehow metaphysically belong here. But nevertheless, this is capital investing. That's what it does. But nonetheless, we've seen it shifting its investments, and they use the term outsourcing sometimes, to other countries where the wage levels are much lower and safety, health, and environmental protection requirements and so on are virtually, if not literally, non-existent. Another major change that's gone on, that's come about and been intensified through this whole period, is the necessity for women as well as men to work in very large numbers in the attempt in particular to maintain a middle-class standard of living and lifestyle. And this has had numerous significant social effects and implications. Among them, very sharply, and in a certain way finding concentrated expression, is the whole question, a certain way being a focus or a concentrated expression of all this, is the whole question of abortion and increasingly birth control. And a whole, if you will, package of things that goes along with that, with the attempt to roll back and eliminate those things. So here you have this very acute contradiction that on the one hand, particularly in terms of maintaining a middle-class standard of living and lifestyle, it is necessary for large numbers of women to work. And this has all kinds of social ramifications. Women develop sources of income independently of men. Their whole view of themselves and the role they should be playing in society, in the family, and so on changes, even spontaneously. Back during World War II, even Leadbelly, I remember when I was in high school, I listened to a Leadbelly record, and he had this song called The National Defense Blues. and he said a lot of his friends were coming to him, and they were saying, Leadbelly. And he said, I say, yeah. They said, Leadbelly, I got a problem. Yeah. Well, my woman, she works in a defense plant, same as me. Well, yeah. And she makes the same money as me. Well, yeah. What then? Well, now I can't tell her what to do anymore. Can't you write a song about it? So he did write a sort of an ironic song called The National Defense Blues, which had that theme about how these men didn't have the same amount of control over their wives anymore. But nonetheless, this phenomenon has taken off in a whole different way in the recent decades. So you have this acute contradiction between that and, on the other hand, the feeling on the part of a significant and now dominant section of the ruling class of the need to forcefully reassert traditional values and, in a concentrated way, patriarchy. And as we pointed out before, this is a highly explosive contradiction. And the ruling class is seeking to resolve it on its terms and in its interests. But again, not only is it spontaneously very volatile, but there's a role to be played by people who don't want to see this contradiction resolved on the terms and in the interest of the ruling class, but on radically different terms and in the interest of the masses of people, women, but also men, ultimately, and in a fundamental sense. So again, this is a very acute contradiction that's resulted due to certain driving underlying contradictions and changes, including in the economic base, but finding then expression in social relations, in culture, in ideology, in the thinking of the people, and all these things then reacting on each other in a highly explosive mix, which is yet to be resolved, to wildly understate it. Another major phenomenon that's come about through this whole period is the growing influx of immigrants, particularly from Mexico and Central America. And this has once again posed itself as a very acute contradiction, obviously for the mass of people in certain ways, but here I'm focusing on the ways in which it's become a particularly acute contradiction for the ruling class. And they see real battles going on inside the ruling class in terms of how to resolve this contradiction. This is an absolute economic necessity of U.S. imperialism at this point. But how do you not eliminate this phenomenon but control it? And how do you make use of it for certain political and ideological ends that would be in the interest of the ruling class, particularly as that's reflected in the eyes of this dominant section of the ruling class? But even within the dominant section of the ruling class, as we've seen, there's Sensenbrenner and there's Bush, and they don't see completely eye to eye on this, and there's a lot of struggle going on. Even in terms of how, within the ruling class, in terms of how to resolve this on their terms and in their interests. So these are some of, and only some of, the acute or very sharp phenomena that have come to the fore in terms of changes within U.S. society and a lot of volatility associated with those changes, and these contradictions are posing themselves very acutely, and the question of what kind of resolution for them is one that is A, up for grabs in a big way, and B, one in which people coming from a revolutionary, and in particular communist position, can and have to exert a tremendous influence in terms of the direction of how they're resolved. Now, stepping back, it's important in a certain way to look in very broad terms at the difference between what is represented by Clinton, and for that matter, Bush 1, Bush the senior on the one hand, and what is represented by W, Bush Jr. on the other. In broad terms, there is under Bush Jr. and the whole core of the ruling class around him a grand strategy which was not there under Clinton or Bush Sr. A grand strategy aimed at reshaping the whole world, beginning with the pivotal region of the Middle East and permanently establishing the U.S. in a position that has never before existed, in a certain sense, in the history of empires in the world. Namely, an unchallenged and unchallengeable empire whose reach extends throughout the whole world, even if there are certain strategic regions of importance within that. So it's a strategic orientation of establishing it in every dimension and ultimately militarily as not only unchallenged but unchallengeable. An unchallenged and unchallengeable world empire on a scale never before seen in history, and certainly never before seen in our lifetimes. And as a key part of this, we should understand this, a key part of this is the orientation, the necessary orientation of remaining on the offensive. You cannot carry out this kind of grand strategy with a halting approach, a half-stepping approach. If every time you run into serious difficulties, you allow yourself to get bogged down, lose confidence, lose your bearings, backtrack, cut and run, etc., etc. You can only do this by remaining on the offensive. That doesn't mean that they have no tactical sense, that they go charging ahead like a bull in a china shop or don't take into account particularity of different contradictions and employ different tactics, like, for example, right now, as has been pointed out in Revolution newspaper. They're now going through, as they did on a certain level with Iraq, they're going through a diplomatic process in relation to Iran. They're not just saying, oh, fuck everybody else, we're going to go. They didn't even do that in Iraq. Ultimately, they did. But first, they went through a charade of going to the UN and, and trying to get resolutions passed and carrying out, blackmail and strong-arm tactics with different countries that were temporary members of the Security Council and bargaining with other imperialists. And now they're doing the same thing with Iran. But there is a strategic orientation there, which says that strategically and not too much in the distant future, you have to continue to go from one offensive to the other, or you will never carry out this grand strategy and you will lose an historic opportunity. And of course, in the eyes of these people, this is all because America, as we'll talk about as we go along more, we'll talk about more as we go along, occupies a special place in the world, in the history of the world, for many of them in God's eyes and God's design. And whatever it does in the world, even dropping nuclear weapons, is always for the good. This is the ideological component of the hardcore of this. Although that view in one form or another, more or less watered down, or not so watered down, is shared by large sections, if not the entire ruling class, and large sections of the middle strata, for that matter. And this is obviously, of necessity, an important arena of ideological struggle. So they have to keep on the offensive, and they have to provide the ideological rationalizations and the ideological foundations for doing this. America's, which I was just referring to, America's special place in the role, what's sometimes in a different form than it's mentioned in the communist movement, but overlapping with it, a certain kind of American exceptionalism. It is the "you're not him" or "you're not me" phenomenon that Bob Dylan spoke to in that song, which I referred to in the memoir. They refused Jesus too, and he said, "You're not him." Well, that's the logic of the U.S. ruling class. You're not us. That's American exceptionalism. Yeah, when you do that, that's bad. But when we do it, it's for a much greater good, not only in narrow political terms, but in the broadest strategic sense, and even in a theological sense for many of them. So they're determined, this core of the ruling class is determined to stay this course, but not only to stay this course, beyond that, to continue pursuing the larger agenda and escalating things, to go from one offensive to the other, even while they're encountering problems with what they've already done. They're not only encountering problems in Iraq, they're encountering new problems in Afghanistan. Michael Schur, who wrote the book, under the title Anonymous, made this point. Imperial hubris. He made this point that the U.S. is going to run into a lot more trouble, and he wrote this several years ago, a lot more trouble in Afghanistan than they're counting on. Now, his ultimate thing was, once we're in this, we got to go and crush everybody. Fuck them. But he was saying, look, we better realize what we're in for. Even in Afghanistan, the problems are going to flare up again in a serious way. We've far from seen the end of the Taliban and related problems in Afghanistan, let alone in Iraq. But that doesn't deter this core. They have a mission, they have a grand strategy, and they have an ideology which underlies, undergirds, and which fires this. Democracy, American exceptionalism, the special role of a shining city on the hill in reshaping the world. All you have to do is listen to Bush's speeches to hear it articulated, and it's not all hypocrisy. It's full of lies, but it's not all hypocrisy. It's full of contradiction. You trample on bourgeois democratic rights in the U.S. increasingly while you're carrying out this democratic crusade in the rest of the world. It's full of lies, full of contradictions, and it is even full of a great deal of hypocrisy, but it's not all hypocrisy. There is a vision and a strategy there. And of course, within all this, particularly now, but in an overall way, given the strategic role of the Middle East and Central Asia and that whole arc of Islamic countries and of Eurasia, Israel plays a very particular and special role in this. This is why I wrote, I believe it was in New Situation and Great Challenges, that the U.S. is now applying under the Bush program, Bush regime, is applying on a global scale what Israel has always applied to itself regionally. This very basic sense that we are special, and what applies to others does not apply to us. Israel has always taken that stance with regard to itself and its role in the Middle East in particular, but in the world in general. And the U.S. under Bush in particular is doing that. They've always done it to a certain extent, but it's been raised to a more concentrated and higher level under this regime. And Israel plays a certain important particular role within this. This is why you will also see that while every U.S. regime or administration is always pro-Israel and always supports Israel above him, as in a superior position above the Palestinians, and as occupying a special place for, U.S. imperialism in that part of the world, this regime is absolutely determined to have a completely one-sided stance with that regard. That openly and without any qualification, everything has to be subordinated to the interests of Israel there, and of course, ultimately, the interests of U.S. imperialism behind Israel and being effected through Israel. And this is why you will see the conscious political operatives, for example, of the Christian fascists doing this whole thing that I referred to in the Pyramid of Power, where they whip up this whole fundamentalist Christian base in this, kind of historically ironic move of giving the most fanatical support to a nation of Christ killers, to Israel. This acute contradiction even found its way into The Sopranos. In one of the episodes with Hesh and his wife are visiting Tony Soprano in the hospital, and this thing comes up about, the wife says, well, they're very pro-Israel, and Hesh says, just wait. So they do have a program beyond that. The program of the Christian fascists, when the time comes for the second coming for the Jews, as long as every other non-believer, it's convert or be condemned to hell and suffer, immeasurably. But right now they are fanatical supporters of Israel, and in that particular, there's a particular theological dimension to that in terms of the Christian fascists, which is, bound up with the idea that the existence and of Israel is a necessary ingredient for the second coming. And therefore, if Israel goes out of existence, that will be a setback for the forces of Christ and for the second coming, and a great victory for the Antichrist. And this is a particular expression of a broader view within this section, the dominant section of the U.S. ruling class, that there must be absolutely no compromise of any strategic nature in terms of the interests of Israel. That's why they are more absolute in their support of Israel than even any previous U.S. administration, because it ties in a very pivotal way with their whole grand strategy. Now, one of the important things to understand, this is not all just a matter of ideas. Ideas, as I've been speaking to, play a very important role in this, but it's not all just a matter of ideas divorced from material reality or ultimately more powerful than material reality. The ways in which and the reasons for which, or because of which, the program of the current core of the ruling class, the Bush regime for short, have come to predominance within the ruling class of the U.S., have to do with very important material factors, particularly on the international scale. And more specifically, they have a lot to do with how the Cold War, quote unquote, got resolved. Here's a question I like to always throw out. What was the other main thing that went on at the time of the first Gulf War under Bush Sr.? Very close proximity to it was the attempted coup by quote-unquote hardliners in the Soviet Union when they put Gorbachev under house arrest for a brief period. That was during that same general period. And that coup was reversed, and that's when Yeltsin, I guess with some support from others, managed to wobble on top of a car and give some sort of semi-articulate speech calling on people to defeat this coup, and then he became sort of the recognized leader of the emerging Russian imperialism, and a lot of support came from the U.S. But for a little while there, it was unclear what was going to happen. The Soviet Union still existed, and Gorbachev was still, nominally in power, and he was arrested by these people in the military who wanted to reverse the direction, and then they couldn't get the necessary backing from other sections of the Soviet ruling class, and in particular the Soviet military, so their coup failed. Had that coup succeeded, it might have changed the whole dynamic of what was going on in the Soviet Union and thereby in the whole world. There were real reasons why it didn't succeed, but we shouldn't be determinists and say it could not possibly have succeeded. There were many things going against it, which I just referred to, but it might have succeeded, and that would have had implications and repercussions, and it would have affected big changes in many dimensions in the world, including the relations between whatever state that was there in the Soviet Union and the U.S. So this was a kind of situation that existed at the time of the first Gulf War, and while the U.S. got the Gorbachev government to go along with expelling Hussein from Kuwait once the U.S. made clear it was determined to do it, it was still a dicey situation of going farther than that. At a certain key point in that war, once the Iraqi forces were clearly going to be driven out of Kuwait, I believe Primakov was his name, was foreign minister of that time under Gorbachev, and he offered his own peace plan. And basically, in general, the Soviet Union was saying, okay, you've achieved your objectives now. You've driven them out of Kuwait. That's what you had authorization from the UN to do, so that's it. And then there was very sharp struggle in the U.S. ruling class, and you hear a lot of denunciation for Bush the senior for not going to Baghdad. Why didn't we just do the job then? Get rid of Saddam Hussein then? Well, partly, as has been pointed out by other people in the ruling class, that was a dicey, difficult prospect because what you see now, the tendencies you see now would have asserted them or might have asserted themselves very sharply then, namely these centrifugal forces pulling apart what had been Iraq might have been, become very powerful then, and it might have created a lot of chaos, not only in Iraq, but spilling over into the whole region. And the U.S. was not really prepared to deal with that then. And that, in turn, interpenetrated with something that's talked about less by ruling class, figures and pundits and so on. Namely, what about the Soviet Union? If you go in and overthrow Saddam Hussein and establish a U.S. puppet government there, as you've done now, what effect is that going to have in terms of how the Soviet Union is going to react to that? And what effect is that going to have on the internal dynamics inside the ruling forces of the Soviet Union and more broadly in that society? Maybe it will end up bringing hardliners back to power and we'll be back to the Cold War. So you see, Bush 1 didn't have complete freedom to do whatever he wanted to do. It's important to understand, once again, as I emphasized before, nobody, no matter how powerful, no class, no core of a class in power, has absolute freedom to do whatever they want to do. They're always confronting necessity. There are always, when you're dealing with a world or even with a country, powerful contradictions that you have to deal with. And keep moving in a way that's generally in the interests of the class you represent, however you understand that. But now things have changed. The Soviet Union is clearly gone. There's a transition of the Clinton program. It's the economy, stupid. Although Clinton did do a lot of things out there in the international arena, including attacking Yugoslavia without UN approval, as some of the Bushites pointed out in the context of this current war with Iraq. But it was kind of transitional, and now we have this grand strategy under this regime. And one of the significant phenomena that's related to this, and part of this, which I've touched on a couple of times already, is what we could call the convergence of neoconservatism and Christian fascism. In other words, people like Wolfowitz, people like his erstwhile boss, Rumsfeld. By the way, I can't help this either. Do you remember one of the most glaring exposures of the depths of perversity of the U.S. media? In the period shortly after 9/11, do you remember how these and they especially had women do this. You remember how they were referring to Rumsfeld, how sexy he was? Think about that. Here is a man who's sexy because he represents unleashed violence and destructive power in the world. This was one of the most disgusting examples of the sycophancy and sickness that's reflected of the U.S. ruling class as reflected in its media. But I don't have time to go very much into that right now. But I couldn't help mentioning it. So we have the Rumsfeld types and the Wolfowitz who are not Christian fascists, more quote-unquote neoconservatives who are more the authors of this grand strategy that I've been talking about, of unrivaled, unchallenged, and even unchallengeable empire. Together with, on the other hand, these forces that are the forces of Christian fundamentalist fascism. And this brew, with, yes, its contradictions, but at this point, its greater unity, clearly has the upper hand within the U.S. ruling class of imperialists at this time. And how they reinforce each other in certain dimensions was spoken to by Kevin Phillips in his book, American Theocracy. And I'll just quote from it here. He says, "Indeed, American foreign policy has its own corollary to the end times worldview of the Christian fascists, in other words. Its own corollary to the end times worldview. The preemptive righteousness of a biblical nation become a high-technology, gospel-spreading superpower." Here he's speaking in a very concentrated way to the linking of this grand strategy with this Christian fascist worldview and how they merge together in terms of empire and aggressively spreading that empire in the world. The preemptive righteousness, it's actually quite well worded, I think, of a biblical nation become a high-technology, gospel-spreading superpower. Now, as for the Christian fascist theocratic element of this ruling class, predominant force and core of power now, they aim at changing the social compact, the social arrangement, if you will, the consensus hammered together to hold the society together under the ruling class, if you want to put it another way. They see the necessity to change that in a whole other dimension, not just in relationship to and in terms of what I was speaking to earlier, namely the New Deal and the Great Society and what emerged through and in the aftermath of World War II and up through the 1960s, although that's part of their program. But beyond that, changing the social compact in relation to the whole historical basis of the U.S. as a country, and in particular a country where the people are highly religious, but the government is secular. And there's a whole other talk in which I will get more fully into the whole religious dimension of this, and a little later in this talk I will come back to the question of thank God for the Christian fascists. But as I've been repeatedly emphasizing here, nobody has absolute freedom in the world. Everybody faces, and the bigger the power you're seeking to exercise and the broader the scope of that, the more you have to deal with a great deal of necessity and very profound contradictions. And for U.S. imperialism in its present position, and particularly in seeking to effect this grand strategy that I've spoken to, there are big contradictions in relation to all this, and forces that already are or potentially could be in significant opposition to these grand designs and ambitions of these imperialists. And just to touch on some of this briefly, internationally, there are contradictions among the imperialists and with major states like China, which is seeking to emerge as a major regional and ultimately world power. There are the contradictions which I referred to with the Islamic fundamentalist forces in the strategic region of the Middle East and in a whole wide arc that encompasses Central Asia and extends all the way to countries like Indonesia. And most decisively and fundamentally, there is the profound contradiction between the compulsions, yes, the compulsions, as well as the actions of the imperialists, and on the other hand, the most fundamental needs and interests of the masses of people in the world, in their billions, and the potential for the communist forces throughout the world to radically repolarize things in the midst of all this in a major way, if they take up and apply the correct outlook and methodology in order to actually confront, to grasp deeply, and transform what is going on in all its complexity, and apply correct principles and a strategic orientation and correct tactics flowing from that in dealing with all this. Now, there are other major sources of problems that the imperialists face, one of which already exists now on a great level, but potentially could exert itself on a whole other level, namely massive debt. There's unprecedented levels of debt in the U.S., including in the government, in terms of private investment and speculation, more specifically, and in terms of broad sections of the population in general, in huge numbers. There's a whole phenomenon of debt and a massive consumption on unprecedented scale, at the same time as very low savings. There's the domination of the financial sector, which is a feature of imperialism, but is very pronounced and takes very, highly parasitic forms in this particular period. We can say that when Lenin spoke about how imperialism puts the seal of parasitism on the whole imperialist society, that this is true on a whole other level of the U.S. today. The view is something like this, and it seeps down even to significant sections of the middle strata and even beyond. Increasingly, the rest of the world produces for the U.S. And U.S. capitalism imperialism is increasingly engaged in investment around the world, and in particular, investment to achieve super exploitation in the third world, along with the restructuring and outsourcing of production. And on top of it all, massive financial speculation. There was just an article in the New York Times about how there was a court ruling that said that the Securities and Exchange Commission cannot control hedge funds, which is a new and rapidly expanding form of highly speculative speculation in debt and general financial speculation. Keeping this going does depend, and we should understand this, keeping all this whole process going, in which the U.S. relates to the world in this way, keeping this going does depend ultimately, and not so very ultimately, on the military and on military power. Military conquest to further reshape and dictate the world, and military enforcement of all this at every point. You cannot maintain this highly parasitic relation of imperialism to the rest of the world and all the attendant effects of this within the U.S. itself without repeatedly bludgeoning other forces in the world into submission and into going along with this kind of an arrangement. Even the relations with other imperialists have a great deal to do with military power, even while it's also true at the same time that the question of direct U.S. military attack against other imperialists, such as France or Germany, is not on the agenda at this time. Nevertheless, the role of U.S. military in the world has a great deal to do with forcing these other imperialists to go along with this arrangement in which parasitism, in which the U.S. feasting like a parasite on the rest of the world, has been raised to previously unseen levels. So we should understand that as well. Even if this massive debt doesn't bring down the whole house of cards, It will continue in various ways to exert pressures and cause major difficulties in terms of the international operation of U.S. capital and U.S. imperialism in a political and geostrategic sense, and in terms of its effects on various strata of the people within the U.S. itself, all of which will be extremely contradictory, but will constitute an important part of the objective stage on which those who are seeking radical, indeed revolutionary change will be operating. And more specifically, it will be a part of what we can and must be working with in striving to bring about repolarization out of all this. Repolarization in the most fundamental strategic sense for revolution. Now, besides the international dimension and besides the particular phenomenon of debt, it's very important not to lose sight of the big social contradictions that the U.S. ruling class faces within the U.S. itself. There is a contradiction with the masses of black people. Despite everything going on with the gangs and a lot of the way in which the masses have been turned against each other, in which they, as I referred to earlier, have been basically written off in large numbers, particularly youth, in terms of employment in the formal economy, and other things have been encouraged, fostered, and built up with very negative consequences for the masses. And I'll talk about that later in another talk when I get around to Bill Clinton and Bill Cosby. And what's the real answer to that? But with all that, the fact is that white supremacy is and has been built into the very foundations and structures of this system. It has historically been, and it remains today, an integral part of the development of capitalism and imperialism in this country. And this has and can only continue to give rise to its opposite through all the contradictory character of this. Namely, its opposite in the form of outrage and resistance, now more dormant, apparently sleeping, spoken quietly in whispers, and now erupting massively. And when we look at what happened around Katrina, for example, and what was laid bare about this system, and the outrage that poured forth from various strata among black people, but also more broadly in relation to that in the society, you can see once again that this is an Achilles heel of the U.S. ruling class. They do not have an answer for these contradictions other than the most horrific kind of one. And whether or not they can pull that off is something that the masses of black people, and more broadly the masses of people, and in a concentrated way, the communists who need to leave them, have something to say about, and must have something to say about. As I've spoken to earlier, there are also major contradictions around patriarchy. Key battles relating to women, as well as the whole gay question, which is very much bound up with the forceful reassertion of patriarchy. There's the question, as I've spoken to also, of immigrants, a highly volatile question for the ruling class, which also does not have any kind of easy resolution for them, whatever they forcibly hammer together in the short run. There was an interesting study called Italians Then, Mexicans Now, on the question of whether or not the millions of immigrants from Mexico could be absorbed into the basic mainstream, if you will, of American society in the same way that Italians were over several generations. There are reasons why the contradictions are very different. It's not some metaphysical thing about being from the third world. There are real contradictions in terms of U.S. relations with Mexico, and this is a different world than it was 75 to 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago. But this is something, and this study is one attempt to speak to this, this is something we need to study and understand more deeply in a scientific way. But besides the particularities of that, which require more analysis and attention, it can definitely be said that this is a highly volatile contradiction as well for the ruling class, for which they do not have any kind of easy solution, and even what they hammer together forcibly now will not and cannot be any fundamental resolution to this if you take into account all the contradictions that are bound up with this, including that between U.S. and Mexico and the needs of U.S. imperialism and the strategy at those at the core of U.S. imperialism now and what that moves them to do in the world. There are the changes that I referred to in the status of significant sections of the working class. There's the orientation, which we have to repeatedly come back to, of mobilizing all positive factors within the proletariat broadly understood, basing ourselves strategically, as Lenin emphasized, on the lower and deeper sections of the proletariat, but seeking to build unity more broadly from that standpoint, and mobilizing all factors with that orientation. There is a significant reserve of people in this country whose political and ideological viewpoints were to a significant degree forged during or have been largely influenced in any case by what came out of the 60s. Here we can turn to Pat Buchanan once again, who emphasizes, besides the great problem of immigrants and the danger of this not remaining a white European country, worrying strategically about the changing composition of the population in the U.S. Besides that, he has repeatedly pointed and continues to point to the great cultural divide in the U.S. and how all this cannot be easily resolved. And in this, he's on to something more correct, even from his own reactionary standpoint, than many of the so-called liberal sections of the ruling class, which are attempting to sort of paper over contradictions which are very real and very deep. There is the phenomenon of the faith-based and reality-based populations in the U.S., which is not the same thing as we've repeatedly emphasized, as the alignment we need for revolution. There's a need for repolarization, but it's a very significant phenomenon, and it ties in with the thing I was saying earlier about how, for the Christian fascist element, the change in the glue holding together the country, if you will, that they are striving to bring about involves, yes, the reversal of verdicts from the 60s, so to speak, but is much broader and far-reaching than that, and involves changing the whole basis on which the country was originally founded, with, as I said, a population that was and always has been highly religious, but a government which was consciously and explicitly established as secular. And this interpenetrates with, while being not simply identical to, this great cultural divide that Pat Buchanan is talking about. He's on to something real with this culture wars thing, although he doesn't see it in terms of the fundamental roots of this and the real underlying dynamics in driving and defining contradictions. The phrase we have used in our characterization of the situation now, not just in the U.S. but in the world as a whole, period of major transition, means just that. A transition from the way the world was being shaped through the 1980s, principally by the contradiction between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. A transition set in motion by the way in which that contradiction was resolved and the Cold War ended, through the unraveling of the Soviet Union and its former empire as such. And this transition is already and will increasingly be anything but smooth. As the other half of the formulation expresses it, it is a transition with the potential for great upheaval. We are already witnessing many manifestations of that upheaval. And all this is being greatly heightened by the wild ambitions of those now at the core of power in the U.S. What is unfolding is indeed a cauldron of contradictions which holds the potential for the two great extremes of terrible setbacks for revolution and the cause of the emancipation of billions of oppressed people in the world, and ultimately all of humanity, or of tremendous advances for that cause, and everything in between. This is where the role of conscious revolutionary forces throughout the world, including in the U.S., can exercise great initiative and affect the direction of things in a way far beyond their current numbers and the current strength of their organized forces. But again, this can be so if, and only if, we take up and apply consistently, systematically, and comprehensively the communist outlook and method in its most advanced expression, and apply this to coming to grips with and transforming the profound and increasingly acute necessity we are confronting. Now that's the end of the first section of this talk. And in relation to all the above, as well as the talk as a whole, I just wanted to give a few references. One is the book The Grand Chessboard by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Another is a book by Mahmoud Mamdani called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. Another is the book by Larry Everest, Oil, Power, and Empire, in particular chapters 1 and 10. And also The Truth About Right-Wing Conspiracy and Why Clinton and the Democrats Are No Answer, Notes on Political Economy, and New Situation, Great Challenges.